Welcome back to the deep dive. Ever wonder why people act so differently in a crowd than they do on their own?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it?
Definitely. And today we're plunging into Sigmund Freud's really intense look at this, based on excerpts from his 1920 work, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego.
And it's worth remembering the context here. Freud's writing just after World War I. He calls it the barbaric conflict.
Right.
Witnessing that kind of mass behavior, that scale of, well, collective action, must have really pushed him to think about this.
Absolutely. It feels like he's trying to make sense of it all. So our source is Freud's text itself, and he's engaging with others who tackled similar questions. Gustave Le Bon is a big one, but also people like Sekel, McDougall, Trotter.
hmm
So our mission in this deep dive is really to follow Freud's train of thought. What actually is a psychological mass? What changes in us as individuals when we become part of one?
And crucially, what holds these groups together? What's
Yeah,
the glue?
exactly. We're going to try and pull out the key insights, the connections Freud makes, and see how he went beyond just describing group behavior to offering a psychoanalytic explanation rooted deep in the individual mind. Let's unpack this.
Okay. So Freud kicks things off with something that might feel a bit counterintuitive. He argues the line we usually draw between individual psychology and social psychology. It's maybe not as sharp as we think.
Oh, right. The idea that individual psychology is just about one person, totally isolated, because that's not really how life works, is it?
Not at all. Freud points out that our individual mental life, well, it almost always involves the other. Someone else is there as a model, maybe an object of our feelings, a helper, sometimes an adversary.
So our relationships, family, friends, partners, even going to the doctor, those are all social, fundamentally.
Precisely. They're only different from maybe the most basic, sort of self-contained states, what Freud might call narcissistic or autistic processes, where someone's finding satisfaction entirely within themselves. But, most of our psychological life involves other people.
Okay, that makes sense. So if our individual psychology already involves others, then social psychology is just looking at that same dynamic, but maybe scaled up.
Pretty much, yeah. Social psychology tends to look at the individual influenced by a lot of people at once, a tribe, a nation, a class, or just a temporary crowd that forms. And because it's about these big numbers, some earlier thinkers wondered, is there some kind of special social instinct that just pops up only in groups?
Like, boom, you're in a crowd and suddenly you've got this instinct you didn't have 5 minutes ago.
Freud was skeptical about that. He found it hard to swallow that just adding more people would magically create a whole new instinct. He suggested instead that the roots of this so-called social instinct probably lie in those smaller, earlier circles, like the family.
Ah, so the way we act in big groups might have its seeds planted way back in how we related to our parents or siblings. Classic Freud.
Exactly. It might be a development, a transformation of those early dynamics.
Okay, so let's get to the core puzzle then. The big question Freud was wrestling with. What is it about being in a mass that makes someone behave so differently?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How can someone, normal, understandable, maybe even predictable, suddenly think, feel, and act in completely unexpected ways when they're part of a psychological mass?
And he really digs into Gustave Le Bon's work here, doesn't he? What was Le Bon's take?
Le Bon gave a really powerful description. He said a psychological mass gives people a kind of collective soul.
The collective soul.
Yeah. And this makes them feel, think, and act completely differently than when they're alone. Ideas, feelings that might have been dormant just kind of burst forth in the crowd. He saw the mass as a temporary thing, a provisional being made of different elements, soldered for an instant.
And his description of what happens to the individual is pretty stark.
Oh, very. Le Bon felt that in a crowd, your individual quirks, your learned personality, they just seem to vanish. He talked about the social unconscious taking over, like the unique parts of you get wiped away, revealing this basic, uniform, unconscious layer underneath.
Like everyone reverts to some kind of baseline, less developed.
That was his idea. And he put it down to a few factors. First, this feeling of invincible power you get from being one of many.
Right.
That sense of power plus anonymity, feeling you won't be held responsible, lets instincts bubble up that are normally kept under wraps.
That feeling of being lost in the crowd. Yeah, I think we can all recognize that pull, even if we resist it.
For sure. Second, Le Bon talked about mental contagion. He linked it to hypnosis, basically. Feelings, actions, they just spread like wildfire through the crowd. People end up sacrificing their own interests just because everyone else is doing it.
You just sort of catch the mood, the impulse,
hmm And his third factor, suggestibility, he thought was the most important. Contagion was really an effect of this. In a crowd, he argued, you lose your conscious personality, your willpower, and you become highly suggestible. You just obey suggestions, almost like you're hypnotized. Ideas turn straight into actions.
Wow. So Le Bon's painting this picture of someone in a mass, losing their conscious self, being driven by these forces, acting on impulse, almost like an automaton.
Pretty much. He even said the individual descends several steps in the ladder of civilization, becoming more instinctive, a barbarian, capable of violence, spontaneity, but also, great enthusiasm or heroism. But intellectual activity, he thought that went way down.
Okay, so that describes the what? The crowd is suggestible, emotional, easily swayed, maybe doesn't care much about facts versus fantasy.
Yeah, Le Bon says they're highly influenceable, credulous, no critical sense. Thinking is in images, associative. Feelings are simple, extreme. They only respond to really intense stuff. Logical arguments are useless. And he notes they're authoritarian as they are intolerant. They respect force, want to be dominated.
But also quite conservative underneath, despite the potential for upheaval.
Yeah, he saw these deep conservative instincts, this fetishistic respect for traditions. And interestingly, on morality, he said, while individual restraints might vanish, allowing for cruelty, the mass could also show amazing selflessness if suggested. Morality could go either way, higher or lower than the individual norm. And crucially, they demand illusions. They prefer the unreal.
Which is where Freud makes a connection, right, to neurosis.
Exactly. Freud hears that description, prioritizing illusion, fantasy over objective reality, and it clicks. It sounds familiar from his work with patients, with dreams, hypnosis, where emotional needs can override reality testing.
Okay, so Le Bon gives this vivid picture, but Freud felt something was missing, didn't he? What was the gap in Le Bon's account for Freud?
Well, a big one was the source of the suggestion. If suggestion and hypnosis are so central, who's the hypnotist? Who's doing the suggesting? Le Bon mentions leaders, but doesn't really drill down into how they wield that influence.
Ah, right, the person out front. How do they get that power?
That's the question. And Freud also thought Le Bon was a bit tangled up. He says contagion is an effect of suggestibility, but then sometimes talks about them like separate causes. Freud wondered maybe contagion is the influence bouncing between members, but suggestion comes from somewhere else, the leader.
Okay.
And even more fundamentally, Freud felt just saying suggestion doesn't really explain anything. It describes this influence that happens without logical reason, but it doesn't tell you the mechanism. How does it actually work?
Right, just saying its suggestion is kind of circular. It happens because it's suggested.
Exactly. It's descriptive, not explanatory. Freud felt this concept hadn't really advanced much. He needed something deeper. And this is where he brings in a concept that was totally foundational for him. Libido.
Libido, okay, but we need to be clear, in this context, it's not just about sex, is it?
No, absolutely not. Freud uses libido really broadly here. It's the energy, the drive behind all instincts connected to love in its widest sense. Yes, sexual union, but also self-love, parent-child love, friendship, even love for humanity, abstract ideas, objects.
So it's the fundamental energy of connection, attachment, binding things together.
That's it. He saw all these different forms of connection as springing from the same basic drives, maybe just channeled differently, sometimes inhibited in their direct aim, but still carrying that core energy of wanting to bind, to connect. He even points out that language itself uses love, this broadly think Plato's Eros or religious writings.
And his big hypothesis is that these affective relationships, these love ties, are the actual force holding groups together.
That's the core idea. What's the glue in a mass? Freud says it's eros, this energy of love and connection. He suggests that when people in a mass give up their individuality and become suggestible, it's because they're acting out of a need to be aligned with others, to feel connected, driven by a kind of love for others.
So the glue is fundamentally emotional. It's about our basic need for connection. That feels like a much deeper explanation than just suggestion.
It really is. It roots group behavior in something fundamental about being human. And to explore this, he looks closely at what he calls artificial masses, highly organized, stable groups like the church and the army. Because they're structured and durable, maybe their underlying dynamics are clearer.
Okay, what did he see in the church and the army?
He saw the individual in these groups as being doubly bound by libidinal ties.
Doubly bound.
Yeah. First, there's a tie to the leader Christ or the general, and second, there are ties to all the other individuals in the group, your comrades, your fellow believers.
So I'm connected vertically to the top and horizontally to everyone beside me.
Exactly. And Freud really stresses that previous thinkers didn't give enough weight to the leader's role. The leader isn't just symbolic, their influence is deeply emotional, based on these libidinal ties. He argues that the individual's loss of freedom, the change in personality in the mass, comes from being anchored by these strong emotional connections to both the leader and the peers.
And he uses panic, particularly military panic, as a kind of proof of this, doesn't he?
Yes, it's a really stark example for him. Panic is the mass dissolving. Suddenly, discipline breaks down, soldiers stop obeying, everyone just scrambles for themselves, ignoring their comrades. Those reciprocal ties just snap.
So the overwhelming fear isn't just about the immediate danger.
Freud argues that the huge, often irrational fear in panic comes not just from the threat, but fundamentally from the breakdown of those emotional bonds. The individual is suddenly terrifyingly isolated, cut off from the very structure that gave them support and identity. That sudden psychological isolation amplifies the fear enormously. Panic shows that the essence of the mass is its libidinal structure. Its collapse is terrifying because connection is lost.
That's a completely different angle than just saying fear is contagious.
Yeah.
The intense fear results from the bonds breaking.
Precisely. He even compares that collective anxiety and panic to individual neurotic anxiety, suggesting both can arise from a sudden shattering of affective ties, that feeling of being utterly alone and unsupported.
He also mentions group intolerance towards outsiders, which feels pretty common.
Yeah, he sees that intolerance, whether it's religious, political, whatever, as naturally arising from how groups form. Defining who's in the group inherently defines who's out. The strength of the internal bonds often seems linked to the strength of the antagonism towards outsiders.
Okay, so libido, this broad energy of connection, is the glue. But how does it work between the members? What's the actual mechanism of that horizontal bond?
This brings him to another really key Freudian concept: identification.
Identification, okay. How does that operate here?
Freud sees identification as maybe the earliest, most basic way we form an emotional tie. Think of a little kid wanting to be like their dad, making dad an ideal. It's not about wanting to possess the dad sexually, that's object choice, but wanting to emulate him, to absorb his qualities into your own self, your own ego.
Right, so identification is wanting to be like the other, while object choice is wanting to have the other.
That's the core distinction. Identification reshapes your own ego based on the model. And he points out that identification can also happen later just by recognizing some shared quality with another person, even someone you're not romantically interested in.
Like sharing an interest or background, or his example of the girls in the boarding school all developing the same cough.
Exactly that symptom example. He calls it psychic infection. One girl gets a hysterical cough, maybe linked to some hidden feeling like jealousy. Other girls, perhaps sharing a similar underlying emotional vulnerability or attitude, unconsciously identify with her based on that shared unspoken trait. And this shared identification then leads them to manifest the same symptom.
That's wild. It shows how powerful these unspoken connections can be.
It really does. And Freud's big hypothesis here is that the mutual tie between members in a mass is this kind of identification. It's built on some shared emotional ground, some common feeling or characteristic that allows them to see themselves in each other.
And this identification between members is somehow kicked off or enabled by the leader.
That's the crucial link. He suggests this mutual identification happens because they all share a common, powerful libidinal tie to the leader. It's like, we all love, admire, follow that person or idea, therefore we have something fundamental in common, therefore we can identify with each other.
Ah, okay, so the shared devotion upwards creates the sideways connection.
That's the model. And to flesh this out, he compares the mass dynamic to two related states: being intensely in love, or enamorment, and hypnosis.
How do they shed light on it?
Well, with enamorment, you get that intense idealization of the loved one. They seem perfect. You don't criticize them. Freud says the loved object gets treated like your own ego. You pour your self-love, your narcissistic libido onto them. In extreme cases, he says, the object has devoured the ego. You become humble, lose your sharp edges, because the loved object has taken the place of your own ego. Ideal, your internal standard of what you aspire to be.
Wow. The person you love replaces your own goals for yourself.
In a way, yes. And he sees almost the exact same dynamic in hypnosis. The hypnotized person shows that same submission, that lack of criticism towards the hypnotist. They give up their own will. It's clear, Freud argues, that the hypnotist has placed himself in the place of the ideal of the ego.
So hypnosis is almost like a two-person mass.
Right.
Or a stripped-down version of being in love.
He calls it a group formation constituted by two persons. It isolates that core relationship, the individual and the leader figure who replaces their ego ideal. It lacks the complexity of the crowd or the direct sexual aims of being in love, making it a useful comparison.
Okay, so pulling these threads together, libido, identification, the leader replacing the ego ideal, he arrives at a kind of formula for what a basic mass is.
Yeah, for a primary mass, one with a clear leader. He defines it as a collection of individuals who have all put the same object, the leader, in the place of their own ego ideal. And because they've all done this, because they share this crucial relationship to the leader, they then develop a general mutual identification with each other.
It all hinges on that shared connection to the top figure. And he sees this whole structure echoing something really ancient.
The primitive horde. He argues that the typical mass, this powerful leader figure dominating a crowd of equals, mirrors the structure anthropologists proposed for early human groups. And the psychology of the mass itself, losing your personality, the rise of emotions and instincts, acting immediately looks like a regression, a throwback to the mental life of that prehistoric horde.
So the mass is a resurrection of the primitive horde. That's a strong claim.
It is. He's suggesting collective psychology isn't new, it's the original human psychology, from a time with a dominant father and the subservient sons. The leader of the modern mass, Freud suggests, is psychologically playing the role of that field, powerful, primitive father, the one who replaces the individual's ego ideal and demands submission.
What about simpler ideas like we just have a social instinct or we're gregarious animals?
He pushes back against that. He doesn't think social feeling is some primary built-in thing. He argues it develops especially in the nursery, the family, maybe school largely as a reaction against envy and rivalry.
Envy. How does envy lead to social bonding? That seems backwards.
Think about siblings again. The older kid envies the new baby getting all the attention. They can't just get rid of the rival, and they see the parents love the rival too. So what can they do? They're forced to identify with the other siblings. They form a community based on their shared predicament, their shared complex relationship with the parents.
Ah, right. So because they all relate to the same authority figure, the parent, and none of them can be the absolute favorite, they bond with each other out of that shared situation.
Exactly. And the first demand that comes out of this, Freud says, is for justice, for equality. Okay, if I can't be the favorite, then nobody should be. It's a transformation of that initial hostile envy into a positive tie, an identification among equals. And crucially, they identify with each other because they share that common emotional tie to the figure outside their group, the parent, or later, the leader.
So the roots of social justice, wanting equality, might actually lie in managing envy and rivalry within our earliest groups, all under the gaze of a common authority. That's quite a take.
It's definitely unexpected. It reframes where our social bonds come from. For Freud, humans aren't just naturally social, we're horde animals, psychologically geared to follow a chief and form bonds based on that shared relationship.
So let's try and recap the main threads here. We started with Le Bon's description of the collective soul, the individual getting lost.
And then saw Freud digging deeper, bringing in libido, that broad energy of love and connection as the fundamental force, the actual glue holding groups together.
Right. And the mechanism for the ties between members is identification, that basic process of wanting to be like others, especially those we share an emotional connection with.
And we really hammered home the critical role of the leader. In Freud's view, the leader takes the place of the individual's ego ideal, commanding devotion, and crucially, enabling that mutual identification among the followers because they all share that same upward tie.
And we tied this back to these deep echoes, the primitive horde, and even the surprising idea that our social feelings might originate in transformed childhood envy within the family structure.
It's a really intricate model he builds, takes earlier observations but filters them through his psychoanalytic lens, connecting mass behavior right back to the individual psyche, our development, and maybe even our evolutionary history.
It's pretty striking how he uses these deeply personal internal concepts: ego, ideal, libido, identification, family dynamics, to explain huge collective phenomena like armies, churches, political movements. It really makes you confront the possibility that the forces moving us in a crowd are much more primal, much more rooted in our earliest attachments than we might like to think.
It definitely challenges any simple notion of us being purely rational actors when we're in a group.
So, thinking about all this now, if our behavior in groups involves this kind of regression, this powerful influence from unconscious ties to a leader and identification with our peers, What does that suggest about the constant push and pull between our individual selves and the groups that shape our lives today? And maybe more importantly, what responsibilities does understanding this place on us as individuals navigating those powerful group dynamics?